Sarah Miller was a vibrant young woman with a passion for helping others. But when she stumbled upon a dark secret involving someone she trusted, her life would end in flames. James Harris, a respected firefighter in the tight-knit town of Redwood Falls, was a hero in the eyes of many, but behind his uniform lay a web of deception, greed, and murder. As Sarah's investigation into a series of mysterious fires grew dangerously close to the truth, she unknowingly became the target of a man who would go to any lengths to protect his deadly secret. What started as a routine case of a house fire soon revealed a chilling conspiracy and a deadly betrayal no one could have seen coming. On a cold, windy evening in the quiet town of Redwood Falls, a loud, crackling sound broke the stillness of the night. The fire department was alerted to a blaze at 123 Pine Street, an address that had once been familiar to many in the small community. It was the home of Sarah Miller, a 23-year-old woman who had been a fixture in town ever since she was a child. Sarah was known for her bright smile, her passion for helping others, and her volunteer work with local charities. But on that night, no one could have predicted the horrors that awaited. As the fire engines raced through the narrow streets, sirens blaring, the firefighters braced themselves for what they would find. When they arrived at the scene, a thick wall of smoke billowed into the sky. The house was ablaze, flames licking the windows and sending sparks high into the air. It was clear the fire was intense and spreading quickly. Neighbors had already gathered outside, watching helplessly as the fire consumed the building. Firefighters immediately began their efforts to contain the blaze. But as they made their way through the smoke and chaos, something seemed off. The house, though burning fiercely, did not have the signs of a typical fire. It wasn't just the damage that was unusual. There was an eerie sense that something didn't fit. After battling the fire for what felt like an eternity, they managed to bring it under control, and the worst of the flames were subdued. It was at that moment, when the fire had been extinguished, that the discovery was made. Firefighters cautiously entered the home, knowing that there could still be danger from the remaining heat. As they moved through the scorched rooms, their hearts sank when they found the body of Sarah Miller. She lay motionless on the living room floor, her lifeless form barely distinguishable from the surrounding destruction. But there was something more chilling about her presence. She hadn't died from the fire. Her body was badly burned, but it became quickly apparent that the flames were not the primary cause of her death. There was no sign of any kind of struggle that would have been expected if she had tried to escape. The house had been locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. It seemed as though Sarah had been alone in the house at the time of the fire, and no one could understand why. As detectives arrived at the scene, they began their investigation with the assumption that Sarah's death was the result of an accident, a tragic outcome of a house fire. It wasn't uncommon for people to die in such fires, either from smoke inhalation or being trapped in a burning home. But as the first responders began their initial assessments, something didn't sit right. The house had been locked from the inside, and no signs of forced entry were found, meaning no burglar or intruder had come in. What didn't add up was Sarah herself. Her phone was found on a nearby counter, untouched. It hadn't been used in hours. This detail raised an immediate question. If she had known there was a fire, why hadn't she called for help? Why wasn't she trying to escape? Even more troubling was the fact that she hadn't made any attempt to alert the authorities. The investigators realized that the fire may not have been an accident at all. Something deeper was going on, something that wasn't immediately apparent. As the investigation deepened, suspicion started to creep in, and one question hung in the air: had Sarah known something she shouldn't have known? And if so, had someone silenced her? The case, which had originally seemed like a tragic accident, was quickly transforming into a mystery that would take the town by surprise. As the investigation into Sarah Miller's death continued, all eyes turned toward the fire department, particularly one firefighter in particular, James Harris. James had been a dedicated member of the Redwood Falls Fire Department for over a decade, known for his calm demeanor and reliable performance under pressure. He was a respected figure in the community, often hailed as a local hero for his bravery during countless emergencies. But as detectives began to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Sarah's death, they discovered that James's connection to the case was more significant than they had first realized. James had responded to the fire at Sarah's home along with his colleagues, but it wasn't just his professional role that attracted attention. It turned out that James had known Sarah for many years. They had grown up in the same town, their lives intersecting on several occasions, but their relationship had recently become more complicated. In the months leading up to Sarah's death, she had been spending a considerable amount of time with James. The two had been seen together at local events, sometimes in casual settings, but there was a growing sense among their friends that something was off. Sarah had always been known for her friendly, outgoing nature, but those who were close to her began to notice a shift in her behavior. She seemed increasingly anxious, almost paranoid at times, and some of her closest friends observed that her interactions with James had become tense. She had started withdrawing from her social circles, no longer attending gatherings with the same enthusiasm she once did. There were whispers that something had gone wrong between them, though no one could quite put their finger on what it was. One of Sarah's friends, who had known her for years, later came forward with unsettling information. In the weeks before her death, Sarah had confided in her about a growing sense of fear. She told her friend that someone close to her had been acting strangely, but when pressed, she refused to name names. It wasn't until after Sarah's death that the friend pieced together the troubling connection. Sarah had mentioned James more than once in her final conversations, speaking of him in ways that suggested she feared he was hiding something, a secret she couldn't yet understand. The police began to look into James's personal life more thoroughly. They learned that James had recently been going through a difficult time. His marriage was falling apart, and he had been facing challenges at work. The pressure seemed to be mounting in all areas of his life, and investigators began to wonder if his personal struggles had contributed to a darker side that no one had seen before. Could someone so respected, so dedicated to serving his community, be capable of something as horrific as Sarah's murder? But there was another strange detail that caught the attention of investigators. On the night of the fire, James had been one of the first responders. However, security footage from a local gas station showed James's car parked near Sarah's home earlier that evening, long before the fire had even started. James had told investigators that he had gone directly to the fire station after finishing his shift, but the footage contradicted his story. Why had he been in the area, so close to Sarah's house, hours before the fire had been reported? The more the police dug, the more inconsistencies they found. James's behavior on the night of the fire seemed increasingly suspicious. He had been at the scene, and yet his actions were unclear. Why had he gone to Sarah's house that night? Had their relationship deteriorated to a point where it had turned dangerous? Was it possible that James had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined? As investigators worked to piece together the timeline of events, one thing became clear: James Harris was at the center of this mystery, and everything about his involvement seemed to be slipping further into the shadows. The quiet, reliable firefighter, it seemed, was hiding a secret, and Sarah Miller had discovered it. As detectives delved deeper into the life of Sarah Miller, they began to uncover a side of her that few had known. Behind her friendly, approachable demeanor, Sarah had been living with increasing fear. To the outside world, she appeared as a typical young woman, outgoing, involved in her community, and eager to help others. But her friends, those who had spent time with her in the months before her tragic death, started to notice unsettling changes in her behavior. She had become more anxious, more withdrawn, and far more secretive than ever before. It seemed that Sarah was hiding something from those closest to her. One of Sarah's childhood friends, Claire, came forward after the investigation was underway, revealing that Sarah had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the fire. Claire described a series of frantic phone calls and late-night texts from Sarah, in which she spoke about feeling increasingly unsafe. Sarah had confided in Claire about a growing suspicion that someone was watching her. At first, the conversation had been vague. Sarah had mentioned that she was worried about a situation she couldn't explain fully. She had refused to say more, but it was clear from the tone of her voice that she was genuinely frightened. It wasn't just paranoia. The more Claire reflected on their conversations, the more certain she became that Sarah was not just worried about an unknown threat, but that she had discovered something that could put her in danger. During one phone call, Sarah had admitted that she was trying to get to the bottom of something that could be linked to the people she trusted the most. But she hadn't revealed what it was. Claire recalled Sarah's last words to her just days before the fire. "I'm going to confront it, whatever it is. I can't live in fear anymore." For a while, no one knew what Sarah had been referring to. But as investigators pieced together Sarah's final days, they began to understand. Sarah had been secretly digging into James Harris's life, her longtime acquaintance and recent companion. What she had discovered in the process was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Police uncovered a series of encrypted emails that Sarah had sent to herself in the days before her death. These emails contained cryptic references to a fire insurance scheme, a scam that had been operating under the radar for some time in Redwood Falls. Sarah had inadvertently stumbled onto something massive, something connected to James's role as a firefighter. She had uncovered evidence that fires were being deliberately set in abandoned properties in order to collect insurance payouts. What had started as a casual suspicion soon escalated into a deep dive into the web of deceit James had built. But Sarah wasn't content with merely knowing. She wanted to expose it, and that was where her downfall began. The truth of what Sarah had uncovered was both horrifying and tragic. James Harris, the man who had been a trusted member of the community, had been using his position in the fire department to orchestrate a series of insurance frauds. He was not alone in this. There were others involved, but Sarah had unknowingly discovered the key to the operation. She had taken it upon herself to gather evidence, convinced that it was her duty to stop the crime before it spiraled out of control. What Sarah hadn't anticipated was that her investigation would lead her into direct conflict with James, a man who, when pushed, would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. It became increasingly clear that Sarah's discovery of James's criminal activities had made her a threat, someone who could bring down the entire scheme. And it was her willingness to confront him that ultimately sealed her fate. James had been involved in this scam for too long, and he knew that if Sarah went public with what she had learned, his entire world would come crashing down. In a desperate attempt to protect himself, James made a decision that would haunt him forever. While Sarah had tried to take control of her own fate, hoping to confront James and expose him, she had underestimated the lengths to which he was willing to go to keep his secret hidden. Her fear had been real, and it was no longer just paranoia. It was the chilling truth. Sarah Miller had uncovered something dangerous, and the closer she got to the truth, the more perilous her life became. The investigation into Sarah Miller's death reached a pivotal moment when detectives uncovered surveillance footage that would shatter the assumption that the fire had been an accident. James Harris, the firefighter who had been one of the first to respond to the fire, became the focal point of the investigation as his actions started to raise more questions than answers. The footage, captured by a security camera from a gas station a few blocks away from Sarah's home, was the key piece of evidence that changed everything. The video clearly showed James's car parked on a side street, only a short walk from Sarah's house, several hours before the fire had been reported. The timestamp on the footage placed James in the area long before the flames had broken out, contradicting his earlier statements to investigators. James had told the police that he had gone straight to the fire station after finishing his shift, but the footage clearly showed his car in the vicinity of Sarah's home. It was an inconsistency that could no longer be ignored. Detectives retraced James's movements on the night of the fire, piecing together his timeline. They discovered that he had been in the area long before the fire started, and this raised the terrifying possibility that James had been there, at Sarah's house, before the blaze erupted. The investigators dug deeper into the events leading up to the fire, questioning whether James's presence was a coincidence or something far more deliberate. It was now clear that James had been in Sarah's neighborhood that evening, but why? The detectives then turned their attention to the fire itself. While they had initially suspected that the fire had been a tragic accident, they now questioned whether it had been intentionally set to cover up a crime. The evidence that Sarah had uncovered about James's involvement in the fire insurance scam made it clear that this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a fire gone wrong, it was part of a much darker story. As the investigation into James deepened, more troubling details emerged. It turned out that James had been involved in setting up similar fires in the past, using his position in the fire department to orchestrate a scheme that involved burning down abandoned properties for insurance payouts. But Sarah had unknowingly stumbled onto his operation, and it appeared that her discovery had put her in grave danger. She had become a threat to James's carefully constructed world of deceit, and it seemed that he had decided to eliminate that threat once and for all. In the days following the fire, detectives uncovered more damning evidence. James's cell phone records showed that he had called Sarah several times in the hours leading up to the fire. The last call, placed just before the blaze broke out, was the most incriminating. It suggested that James had tried to reach her, perhaps to stop her from going forward with her investigation or to confront her about what she had discovered. What happened during that final call remained a mystery, but it was clear that James's involvement in Sarah's death was no accident. By now, the evidence was overwhelming. James had been at Sarah's house before the fire, and his actions on the night of the blaze indicated a level of premeditation. He had not only been aware of the fire, but had likely played a key role in starting it. The fire, originally thought to be an uncontrollable accident, now appeared to be part of a larger, more deliberate scheme to silence someone who had come too close to the truth. As the police tightened their grip on James, the community was rocked by the realization that the man they had trusted, the firefighter who had been their hero, was hiding a dark and dangerous secret. The quiet, reliable man who had risked his life to save others had been living a double life. And Sarah Miller had been the unfortunate victim of his desperate attempt to protect that secret. The investigation was now heading toward its inevitable conclusion, and the truth about what had happened that night was becoming clearer with every passing day. As the case against James Harris began to unravel, the shocking truth about Sarah Miller's death was finally revealed. The evidence that had been gathered, from the surveillance footage to phone records, pointed unmistakably toward James as the person responsible for Sarah's murder. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident caused by a house fire had turned into a horrifying revelation. Sarah Miller had been deliberately silenced because she had uncovered a dangerous secret that threatened to expose James's criminal activities. The investigation revealed the depth of James's involvement in an illegal fire insurance scam. Over the course of several years, James had been using his position as a firefighter to orchestrate fires in abandoned properties, allowing him to collect substantial insurance payouts. This had been a well-planned scheme, one that involved several people in the town, all of whom had managed to stay under the radar for years. But Sarah, unknowingly, had stumbled onto the truth. Her curiosity, her determination to uncover what was happening in her town, had led her to investigate James's activities, and it was this discovery that had sealed her fate. In the weeks leading up to her death, Sarah had gathered enough evidence to expose James and the other individuals involved in the scheme. She had begun to piece together the connections between the fires and the people profiting from them. But Sarah had not shared her findings with anyone, fearing that if she did, it might put her in danger. Her fears were not unfounded. James had realized that she was getting too close, and he knew that if she went public with what she knew, his entire operation would come crashing down. On the night of the fire, James went to Sarah's house, intending to confront her about what she had discovered. What happened during that confrontation was still a mystery, but it was clear that it had escalated quickly. In a fit of panic, James killed Sarah, knowing that her death would be the only way to stop her from revealing his secrets. He then set the house on fire, hoping to destroy any evidence of his involvement and make it look like a tragic accident. The fire, however, did not do the job as he had hoped. Despite the intense flames, Sarah's body was found intact, and the investigation quickly shifted to focus on her suspicious death. The breakthrough came when the police uncovered the phone records and the footage of James's car near Sarah's house hours before the fire. It became clear that James had been at her house that night, and the evidence pointed to him as the one who had deliberately set the fire to cover up his crime. Sarah's discovery of his involvement in the scam had forced him into a corner, and in his desperation to protect himself, he had killed her. James was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and as the investigation continued, more people were implicated in the fire insurance scheme. The community was rocked by the revelation that someone they had trusted for so long had been living a double life, using his position as a firefighter to exploit the very people he had sworn to protect. Sarah Miller's tragic death, while heartbreaking, ultimately brought down a dangerous criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight. Her courage, her desire to uncover the truth, and her determination to confront the darkness lurking in her town became the catalyst for the unraveling of a web of deceit that no one had suspected. The community of Redwood Falls would never be the same, and while justice had been served, the scars left behind by Sarah's murder would linger for years to come. In the end, the truth had been exposed, but it came at a terrible price. The quiet, respected firefighter, James Harris, had turned out to be a cold-blooded killer, and his secret was finally laid bare for all to see.